One of the most significant events in world history and Asian history was the Russo-Japanese War, 1904 to 1905. Most people aren't familiar with this war. We don't focus on battles or anything like that, but I do want to emphasize why it's significant. And we're going to hopefully have a better answer now for this question: how did Japan's development after 1800 compare with China's? So, a little context on Meiji Japan by this point. We'll look at Russia very briefly, and then we'll move on to the Russo-Japanese War, the treaty that concluded the war, and this theme of Yellow Peril. Um, so, this image I've shown before. The British political cartoonist drew a very small looking Japan on top of this big Chinese warrior to symbolize Japan defeating China in the First Sino-Japanese War. Notice here at the end of the 1800s, they're using terminology we would not use. This is a derogatory term here for Japanese people. But the significance here is that Japan is getting a seat at the table because it's finally starting to gain more respect from Western powers. This illustration I've shown as well. Western powers sitting around the table carving up the China pie, and you can see Japan right here on the side, looking on, waiting, observing, being very studious, it would seem. Um, so this is taking place after the First Sino-Japanese War. So Japan gets a seat at the table, but Japan is not going to be respected as a global power until after this Russo-Japanese War. So I want to provide some context on Russia here. This is just an illustration, okay? This is a flat map, and I realize that the world is not flat, so this flat line doesn't really accurately depict how the world looks. But if you just notice the United States here and Russia over here, most of Russia is above where the U.S. is, and it's cold, super cold in Russia. The Russians really wanted a warm water port so that they could have, for their navy and for trade, if they have a warm water port, it's just easier for them to be able to station their navy somewhere and be able to trade. Now, they try a couple of different times to gain a warm water port. They try here in Crimea. This is the Crimean Peninsula. They try here in today is called Turkey, but back then it was the Ottoman Empire. And the goal here in both of these wars, the Russians wanted to be able to get their ships out into the Mediterranean Sea. And then once the Suez Canal is constructed in Egypt, they're able to go down through the Mediterranean and down here into the ocean. So that's what the Russians wanted to do. They lost in Crimea in 1856, and then in the Ottoman Empire, they actually won there in the Russo-Turkish War in 1878. They actually won, but then Western powers stepped in and forced the Russians to give back a lot of the land that they controlled. So Russians just feel very annoyed and upset by this. You can see this illustration here of Russia as an octopus, and its tentacles are stretching out in different places, but notice it can't get beyond these borders into Europe. It can't get down anywhere beyond its borders. Um, and so the Russians are pretty upset. They can't get a warm water port on the western side. They turn to the eastern side. So they do get a port in Vladivostok. Problem with that port is that the water freezes over throughout half of the year. So for a portion of the year, it's warm and ships can dock there. But for a lot of the year, it's frozen over. So Vladivostok was a temporary solution, but it wasn't great. The other one is Port Arthur. Port Arthur is in China, and the Russians want Port Arthur. so they can make that their warm water port. Well, who's going to have a problem with the Russians having this port there in East Asia? Well, Japan. Japan's going to have a problem with this. And you can see here from this illustration that there were a lot of railways going from St. Petersburg and Moscow, going all the way down to Vladivostok here, and then the Russians are able to get Port Arthur, and they begin to construct new railways, and they have more access throughout Manchuria. So, interesting point here. After the First Sino-Japanese War, the Japanese got Port Arthur. So it's in China. The Japanese won against China, and the Japanese were able to control Port Arthur after the First Sino-Japanese War. The problem was that France and Germany and even Russia threatened to go to war with Japan if they kept that whole peninsula, the Liaodong Peninsula. So the Japanese had to give it back, and that was very humiliating for them. The Russians then are able to lease Port Arthur from the Chinese because it's right here near all their railways, and it's not that far from the Russian borders, and it gives them a warm water port. Now, the from a Chinese context, they lost the First Sino-Japanese War, 1895, and then very soon thereafter they had this Boxer Uprising. And I've shown this before. So in the Boxer Uprising, 1899, 1901, the Russians and the Japanese contribute the most forces to stopping the Boxers. They're in Manchuria. So if I go back here just real briefly, if you look at the map, you can see Japan here, Russia here, and Manchuria is right in the middle between these two countries going into China. So after the Boxer Uprising, the Russians and the Japanese are supposed to remove their troops from Manchuria, but they don't. And so this becomes a lot of tension between the Russians and the Japanese, and really these two countries are fighting over control in Manchuria and in Port Arthur. We end up with war. This is the Russo-Japanese War. You can see this illustration of Emperor Meiji right here. Tsar Nicholas II for the Russians here. And then in the middle is Teddy Roosevelt, U.S. president at that time, who brokered the treaty of Portsmouth between those two countries. And you can see neither country really wins in the technical sense. I mean, the Japanese win, but both of them suffer huge losses. You can see the skulls in the background behind Russia. A lot of skulls. He's got a peg leg, his arm's in a sling, his head is bandaged. On the other side is Emperor Meiji. He doesn't have as many injuries, doesn't have any injuries, but there are still a significant number of skulls here representing the Japanese deaths. So both sides suffer huge casualties in this war, but the Japanese win. This is huge because no one thought the Japanese would be able to compete with a quote-unquote Western power, and here it's the Russians. Russia is gigantic compared to the tiny islands that make up Japan. So it was a big deal, and President Roosevelt has these powers meet, and so they have this Treaty of Portsmouth in 1905. Roosevelt wins the Nobel Peace Prize in 1906 because of this treaty. As you look at this treaty, think about what did Japan get from this treaty. So what did Japan get? How did this treaty affect the Chinese? And then really, how does this treaty compare to other treaties that we've looked at, whether it's the Treaty of Nanjing after the First Opium War or the Harris Treaty that the Japanese had to sign when the Americans arrived in Japan in the 1850s? Think about those things, okay? Now, no surprise here, since the Russians and Japanese were fighting over Manchuria and especially over Port Arthur, it's not a coincidence that the Japanese finally get control of Port Arthur after this war. But this leads to the Yellow Peril. I got ahead of myself. So peril refers to danger, fear. And this was very common after the Japanese defeated the Russians. Fear of Asia, fear of the yellow race, which is a derogatory way to think about Asian people. But I'm going to show you a French political cartoon. There are 5 panels. There's no text. It's just 5 panels, and I'll show them to you. And I want you to think about how these images depict this yellow peril. This is the first image. Here's the second image. Third. Fourth. Fifth. These images are available online as well, and you can look at them there. But I think these images really show um, fear that Western powers had of a rising and an awakening Asia. Specifically here, it's supposed to be Japan. Um, and I can actually go back real quick and show you um, from left to right. So this is supposed to be Tsar Nicholas II of Russia. This is supposed to be France, Great Britain, and then Germany. The Germans are usually, you can usually spot them because of the pointy hats. And here, the artist drew pointy spikes on his mustache as well. Take a look at those images online, or just pause the video and you can look at them one by one. Um, there is a longer reading for this section on the Russo-Japanese War. I want you to look at a scholar who writes about the significance of the Russo-Japanese War. So this is Camille Iden. Move my hat out of the way again. So it's a global anti-Western moment, the Russo-Japanese War, decolonization, and Asian modernity. There's a lot in this article. It can be very dense. It's longer than other things that we read. But there are a lot of questions that I think will help you as you read through this to focus on. Why does he believe that this war was an important global moment? What was unique about Japanese modernization? Why did it appeal to other Asian countries, or even other colonized countries as well? What does the title of this chapter mean? What main point did you take away from it? And what is this person's overall argument? Do you agree or do you disagree with what it is that he's trying to say? I think that it's a very dense article, so there's a lot in there to try to make sense of. But talk about those things. Go to Canvas and post online, and you can begin to share your point of view. I think that makes all the difference as you're looking at this document. We're part of a community of scholars here, all of us. We're learning this together. So try to talk about it together. Post something, your reaction to this article. Maybe respond to one of these questions if you want to, and then respond to somebody else and respond to somebody else and just keep responding and start being part of this conversation, okay? That's all I've got, ladies and gentlemen, so have a great day and I'll see you next time.